In the 1881 census, a widow living quietly in the town of Marlborough gave her occupation in just 2 words: retired draper. It is an unexpectedly revealing phrase, because Sarah Ann Glover had not lived a small life. Born in a Gloucestershire market town, she crossed the Atlantic multiple times, raised a family between England and British Guiana, helped sustain a provincial business dynasty, and remained the centre of a far-flung family for more than half a century. Stay with us as we explore the story of Sarah Ann Sweeting, discover the worlds she moved between, and uncover the quiet resilience behind an outwardly ordinary Victorian life. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up, and if you like the content and want more, hit the subscribe button and tap that notification bell. Sarah Ann Sweeting was born in Tetbury, Gloucestershire, in the summer of 1814. At first glance, her beginnings were modest enough. Her father, Daniel Niblet Sweeting, worked as a plumber and painter in the town. Tetbury itself sat within the wider cloth country of the Cotswolds, shaped by trade, markets, and the long rhythms of textile production. But beneath that apparently ordinary provincial setting sat layers of history and belief that would quietly shape Sarah's world. Her father's family had Welsh roots in Glamorgan. Her mother's family carried older dissenting traditions, including Quaker connections stretching back generations. One ancestor, Joan Vokins, had been part of the turbulent early Quaker movement in the 17th century. But by Sarah's lifetime, those links had softened and shifted, although the inheritance of independent religious thinking had not entirely disappeared. And Sarah grew up in a household already marked by loss. Of 6 children born to her parents, only 2 are known to have survived into adulthood. Her older brother David was 17 years older than her. The other children largely died in infancy or childhood. So although Sarah was not technically an only child, she effectively grew up as the sole child in the household for most of her upbringing. That experience, perhaps, helps explain something later visible in the records: a woman who appears steady, adaptable, and quietly self-contained. In 1838, Sarah married Joseph Thomas Glover at the Tetbury Parish Church. Joseph was not simply a local shopkeeper. He was already connected to Bristol and to Atlantic trade with the West Indies. In later years, he stated he had been involved in shipping to the Caribbean since the early 1830s. And with that marriage, Sarah's life expanded dramatically. The family backgrounds also brought together several strands of Protestant descent. Sarah's family carried echoes of Quakerism. Joseph's family had roots in the Calvinistic Methodist revival associated with George Whitefield. By the late 1830s, both were moving within the orbit of the early Brethren movement, centred around Bristol and Bethesda Chapel. That world valued scripture, lay preaching, missionary enthusiasm, commercial integrity, and practical independence. Those values seem to run quietly through the whole family story. Still, none of that could fully prepare a young woman from Tetbury for what came next. Within a few years of marriage, Sarah was living in British Guiana. Today we might struggle to appreciate just how immense that journey was for an early Victorian woman. This was not tourism. It meant months at sea, unfamiliar climates, disease risks, separation from extended family, and the challenge of managing a household in a colonial environment utterly unlike Gloucestershire. And Sarah did not make the crossing once. The birthplaces of her children traced the movements of the family almost like pins on a map. Several children were born in Demerara. Then the family appeared back in Britain, in Swansea, where Joseph opened a drapery and outfitting business, aimed partly at those trading to tropical climates. Then came another return to British Guiana, where more children were born, before the family eventually resettled permanently in England. So by the early 1850s, Sarah had crossed the Atlantic at least twice while raising young children. The records never tell us what she thought about these journeys. Victorian documents are often maddeningly silent about women's inner lives, but the journeys themselves tell us something. They required endurance, organisation, adaptability and nerve. This was not a fragile woman confined to one parish her entire life. And there is another striking feature to the family's story. Even while moving repeatedly between continents, Sarah remained the stable centre of the household. Children arrived, businesses changed, locations shifted. The wider Glover family became scattered between England, the Caribbean, and in time New Zealand, but Sarah remained the fixed point around which the family revolved. Eventually, the travelling years settled into something more stable. By the early 1860s, the family had established themselves in Kingsbury Street, Marlborough, where Joseph built a successful drapery and outfitting business. For perhaps the first time in Sarah's adult life, there was continuity of place. But this was no small household. Several children still lived at home. Servants were employed. An orphaned nephew from Demerara was taken into the family after the death of Joseph's brother in the Caribbean. The household was domestic, commercial, and extended all at once. And although Victorian census returns usually hide married women behind the occupations of their husbands, it is difficult to imagine Sarah as merely a passive observer in the business. Drapery was not simply accounting and stock books. It was relationships, supervision, organisation, trust, presentation, and relentless day-to-day labour. By 1872, two of the sons were already working as drapers' assistants. The trade had become a family identity. Then, in 1872, Joseph died. He was only 62, and it is here that Sarah emerges most clearly from the shadows of the records. Joseph's will was carefully structured. The business was to continue under the management of their son John during Sarah's lifetime, with profits supporting her directly. She was not treated as incidental to the business. She was central to its continuation. And 9 years later, when the census enumerated came calling in Marlborough, Sarah described herself with quiet precision. Not widow, not annuitant, not living on own means, but retired draper. 2 words, but they reveal a great deal. Victorian women are often difficult to see clearly in the historical record, because their work was folded invisibly into household life. But Sarah clearly understood herself as someone who had belonged to the trade, not merely married into it, part of it. There is something else quietly human in the records too. Across later censuses, Sarah consistently understated her age by a year or 2. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. By the time of her death, even her family accepted the slightly younger version she had apparently been presenting for years. You can almost glimpse the faint smile behind the paperwork. Sarah outlived Joseph by more than 20 years. Over that time, her children dispersed further across the English-speaking world. One son ultimately settled in New Zealand. Others remained tied to drapery and commerce in England and the Caribbean. Her unmarried daughter Sissy stayed closely alongside her for decades. In later life, Sarah returned to Gloucestershire, living in Dursley with her daughter and son David, himself now a draper, and the trade continued into another generation. And then in the final weeks of her life she moved again, this time to Clevedon in Somerset, where a grandson cared for her, and she died there in January 1893 after a short illness. And yet even then, a family notice announcing her death appeared in the Marlborough Times, because Marlborough had become home. Not Tetbury, not Bristol, not Demerara, not Swansea, the place where the family's long years of movement had finally settled. Sarah Ann Glover left behind no diary, no memoir, and no bundle of personal letters explaining herself to posterity. What survives instead are fragments, census returns, wills, baptisms, addresses, occupations, and the scattered geography of her children's births. But taken together they reveal something substantial. A woman born into provincial Gloucestershire trades family became part of a remarkably mobile 19th century world, linked by commerce, religion and empire. She crossed oceans, sustained a large and complicated household, weathered widowhood, participated in a family business, and remained the emotional centre of an increasingly scattered family network. Not famous, not wealthy, not historically celebrated, but quietly formidable nonetheless. One of the challenges in family history is that women can easily disappear into the records. They often appear only as daughters, wives, or widows, while the occupations and public identities belong to the men around them. And that is why small details matter. In Sarah Ann Glover's case, one census entry changed the way her life could be understood. Retired draper. 2 simple words that revealed she did not see herself merely as the widow of a businessman, but as someone who had been part of the trade herself. Sometimes family history turns not on dramatic discoveries, but on paying attention to the quiet clues hidden in plain sight. And if you have encountered similar stories in your own research, or uncovered ancestors whose lives turned out to be much larger than the records first suggested, I'd love to hear about them in the comments below.